Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to the Korea Economic Institute. My name is Troy Stangerone, and I'm the Senior Director for Congressional Affairs and Trade here at KAI. Over the last half century, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, with South Korea being one of the foremost success stories of the second half of the last century, and being the first developing country to move from an international aid recipient to donor status. At a conference held here at KAI in April, in conjunction with the International Council on Korean Studies and the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, Rick Katz of the Oriental Economists presented a paper that indicated that Korea's economy is the only economy among the major developing and developed nations to show strong economic growth through the last 50 years. As developing nations in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and other regions of the world look for the keys to economic success, South Korea potentially presents many insightful lessons for them to consider. We have often heard about the role education played in Korea's economic development and its use of an export-led growth strategy. But one of the things that we often hear less about is the role that foreign direct investment played in Korea's economic development. We are fortunate here today to have Dr. E.K. Woo with us. He is an expert on development assistance and other issues related to this topic. Dr. Lee is an economics professor and was the managing director of the Development, Education, and Research Network of the Korea Development Institute's School of Public Policy and Management in South Korea. Previously, he was a chair professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Hankook University of Foreign Studies. He also taught at the Graduate School of International Studies at SNU in Seoul and at Ewha University. He has also been a visiting professor at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson Graduate School of International and Public Affairs. Prior to his teaching career, he was a member of the Prime Minister's Committee on International Development and Cooperation and served as an advisor to the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Korea Export-Import Bank. Before repatriating to Korea in 1998, Dr. Lee served with the World Bank here in Washington, D.C. in various capacities, including in executive roles and in economic positions. While he was serving at the World Bank, Dr. Lee was accorded with the Presidential Award for Excellence in Project Outcomes in 1997. Dr. Lee, I'll turn the podium over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Troy, for your kind introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to meet you here. And also, before talking, I'd like to express my appreciation to KEI for inviting me to this prestigious organization and this seminar series. I know many of you are still eating, so please go ahead. I think we can do two things at the same time. When I was here in Washington, I remember President Reagan was running a campaign, and he criticized President Gerry Ford that he cannot walk and chewing gum at the same time. But Mr. Reagan says he can do both things at the same time. So I think you can chew and listen at the same time. The topic I want to talk about is what kind of role the aid, especially official aid, played in the Korean economic development processes. So we go back a little more history. The reason is we can draw some lessons from this 1945 to 1995 experience. Okay, so I will go over the whole 45-95 period and around the aid role, and then we can go a little bit more in detail about the official foreign assistance between 1945 and 1960 period, and another period, 1961 and the 1990 period. The reason is mainly because 1961 was a turning point in the history of Korea's aid development. And then I will try to draw in a form of a summary, some lessons we have discussed. Okay. The issues I want to talk about three is how much and what kind of official aid did Korea receive? And the second one is where and for what purpose did Korea apply official aid? And the third one is what were the effects of the official aid? The objective of discussing these three key issues, of course, is drawing lessons from Korea's experience and then also assess their applicability to other developing countries. But I will be concentrating more on drawing lessons from Korea's experience. I don't intend to do the assessing their applicability to other developing countries because each country has different historical and economic and social background, and therefore applicability may have to be assessed by a specialist who know the countries better. I don't intend to know all countries in the area of development. Okay. Well, we said Korea has a very fast economic growth rate. So I want to show is that really true? Since I'm an economist, I'm trying to verify my statement with some evidence. And during 1965 to 1990, I listed some countries, especially in comparison with Latin American countries and East Asian countries. Because during 1960s or 65, Latin American countries were growing very fast on the basis of import substitution industrialization policies. But since 1965, Latin American on average growth rate was 1.2, but East Asia growth rate was much higher at 5.6% per year. And Korea grew much faster at 7.1%. Some people may say China grew faster, but during that period, China has not toppled Korea yet. I think since then, China has grown much faster. But one of the country, for example, also OECD member, Mexico, had twice the higher GNP per capita during 1960, but in 2005, the Korea GDP per capita was twice that of Mexico's. So it shows Korea has grown very fast. Okay. Now, to show that Korea's growth rate was exceptional, I tried to compare what was the growth rate, what was the economic performance, especially in the growth performance between some peer countries during 1960 and 1995 and 1990, I think. So when I compare it, there was about 50 or 60 countries which were having per capita income of $300 or less during 1960s, because the Korean GNP per capita was 87 in 1960, and then it became $300 in 1970. So during that period, I made a survey of other countries which had per capita income $300 and fewer. And there was 55 countries, and in those 55 countries, their per capita income in 1995 was grouped as follow. About 3 countries reached between 3,000 and 10,000, including Brazil, Oman, and St. Kitts. But the majority of countries were between $300 and 1,000. Say there are 27 countries in that group. And then the 11 countries were 1,000 and 3,000. And then 13 countries are still below $300 per capita income. But Korea reached $11,000 in 1990, and then by 1995, it reached 11,468. So definitely it shows Korea growth performance was much higher than other countries. Then what was the cause for this fast growth rate? Some people argue that Korea received much more aid, especially from United States, than other countries. So I was trying to verify whether that is true or not. So for the same group of countries, some 60 countries, I checked how much they received aid. So during 1960 and the 95, I checked the amount of aid they received as a percentage of their GDP. So when I checked it, on average, all 60 countries received about 6%. But some group of countries, like 15 countries, had like more than 10% of their GDP as aid. And another 20 countries was between 5 and 10% of GDP. And then also 11 countries between 2 and 5%. Korea belonged only to those 10 countries which had aid as percentage of GDP was less than 2%. Actually, Korea received 1.4%. When I say the aid here is what the OECD DAC defines official development assistance. Okay, and this official development assistance means the grants and some other type loans. That loan has a grant element greater than 25%. So in terms of aid, Korea did not receive much compared to other countries. And therefore, we cannot say faster industrialization and economic growth of Korea is due to large amount of aid Korea has received. Even if I combined ODA and then other official aid, which include loans, which has a grant element smaller than 25%, then still it was only 4% of GDP. So it's much lower than average aid amount of the 60 countries. I don't know whether I have to explain the grant element. I think most of you have some idea of grant element. Okay? So I will skip this one. Then how much Korea received aid during 1960 to 1945 to 1999 is altogether the total amount was 44 billion. And this 44 billion can be divided between a grant and the loan. Grant was only 7 billion, and the loan was 37 billion. So about 84% of the total aid was loans, and then only 16% was grant, like 7 billions. This 44 billion can be also divided between bilateral and the multilateral. About half and half was bilateral and the multilateral aid. So the majority of the loan was coming from multilateral sources, and also the majority of loan, about out of 37 billion, 31 billion was OOA, which is a grant element less than 25%. So that makes a sharp contrast with the current day aid to many developing countries, because currently OECD DAC aid is about more than 96% some grant element. So and very few loans actually. So if we can say if aid has made some contribution to fast economic growth and industrialization, we can say it is due to loan, not so much grant. And among the loans, it may be more OOA, in other words, more grant element, smaller than 25%. Okay. In terms of a bilateral aid, majority is coming from United States and Japan and Germany and Saudi Arabia and some France. In terms of a multilateral aid, it comes from UN civil rehabilitation in Korea, and then UNCRA, the UN Korea Reconstruction Agency, and then World Bank IDA, and also World Food Program and the UNDP program like that. Okay. That is official development assistance. In other words, more grant element higher than 25%. But for those loan element which has lower than 25% and then greater than 25%, I classified separately. And this one is loan lower than 25% grant element. And it shows is 31 billion out of 37 billion. And only 6 billion is grant element higher than 25%. If we classify the all official aid into different sectors, how Korea applied it, then we can see the social and administrative infrastructure and the services was 12%. And then also economic infrastructure was 51%, and the production sector was 24%. So altogether, infrastructure is about 75%, and the social and the government infrastructure and services was 12%. And this makes a sharp contrast with the current OECD DAC assistance, because current OECD DAC assistance shows about 45% is social and administrative infrastructure and services. And then infrastructure and production sector is 24% only. Therefore, we can say if aid made any contribution to faster economic growth and industrialization in Korea, it may be due to this sectoral allocation of aid, because Korea has provided majority of aid on infrastructure, economic infrastructure, and production sectors, and very little for social and the government infrastructure and services. On the other hand, why many developing countries, they receive aid, but why their growth rate is not growing very fast, maybe this kind of sectoral allocation may be very unbalanced, because they spend 50% for social and administrative services, and then only 25% for infrastructure. Okay. To support my argument, I looked at what is the source of growth in Korea. There are many studies made, say more than 20 studies, but the latest, just a year ago, a group of Harvard made a study again, like Eichengreen and Perkins, and they made a study, say, during 1964-79, Korea grew 8.7% per year. And this growth converted into the 100%. In other words, 57% of growth was due to physical capital investment. And then human capital investment contributed only 4%. And the employment 26%, and total factor productivity was 13%. So Korea's growth was driven by heavy investment in physical capital and human capital and TF productivity. So how the investment was financed? So that's why I want to look at it, and then I can see those investments as percentage of GDP, 15%, 24%, 28%, 31% was financed in this way. Half was financed by domestic savings until 1970, and the other half was financed by foreign aid. So foreign aid was financing investment gap more than 50%. But after 1970, the role was much reduced because most active growth and industrialization took place this period. And then after that, during 1980, it was more stabilized and more harmonized and the growth, slow growth. Okay? And therefore, we can attribute faster industrialization and the growth was due to this kind of a sectoral allocation of aid pattern, because Korea invested a lot of aid for infrastructure and little on the social and administrative sectors. But OECD DAC currently provide a lot of aid for social and administrative sector, but very few on infrastructure sector and production sector. That's why there was the difference, sharp difference in the growth performance between Korea during 1945 and then 1970, and then OECD DAC aid recipient. That is actually my key argument in this seminar. So to support my argument, if we can look at the evolution of Korea's development a little bit more in detail, as I said, we can divide into two periods. One, 1940-50 period, another one, 1960s and 70s and 80s. We can look at it. The two periods has a sharp difference in the objective of aid, because in the 1940 and the 50s, the aid was mainly for emergency relief from the World War II, the Korean colonization by Japan, and then also Korean War, and some rehabilitation from those disasters. And therefore, aid was mainly for emergency relief and the rehabilitation. On the other hand, from 1960, 70, 80, the aid objective was mostly for industrialization and the growth. And one means of those achieving objective was in the 1940-50 was mainly grants, all grants actually, about $3 billion of grant. But in the 1960 and the 70, the grants was fading out, and the majority was loan, especially OOA type loan, which is has a grant element smaller than 25%. So if I look at the 1945-60 period, the official foreign assistance role, first in the background, as I said, Korea had a triple disasters, and the Japanese occupation and exploitation, and when the end of World War II, and then after Korean independence, we had some civil strife, Korean War during 1950 and 53. And then we had heavy destruction and deprivations, okay? And therefore, Korea had a desperate need for survival and humanitarian relief before and during the Korean War, and it needed heavy rehabilitation, reconstruction after the Korean War. During this period, U.S. military administered Korea before Korea established its government in 1948. And also, Korea, after that, Korea was ideologically divided, and so North and South was having strife. And the per capita income during that time was only $60 to $70. And it has a very high literacy rate, almost 80% in 1945. And then also it has a destruction of infrastructure and the productive facilities during the Second World War and the Korean War time. The damage was estimated at $3 billion. And actually, the aid that Korea received in the 1940, 50 period was actually exactly $3 billion. So economic growth rate was very low, and on average between 4 and 5%. And as I said at that time, also internationally there was a changes because the European countries and Japan were assisted by the U.S., especially Marshall Plan, and also World Bank for rehabilitation and reconstruction. And by 1958, European countries become fully recovered. And then also after 1958, OEC was turned into OECD because European countries, they realized they cannot grow faster unless they have some more intense relationship with developing countries. And also for development aid assistance, they established DAC in 1962. And aid agencies were mostly, as I said, the US and the UN. But the UN agencies were only 21% of a total, accounted 21% of a total aid. The rest, 80%, was provided by US during 1940s and the 50s. As I said, the objective of aid during that time is humanitarian relief and rehabilitation. And another important condition for those aid was macroeconomic stabilization and the fiscal austerity policies. And some construction since 1953. And the type of aid was mostly grants. And the majority of these grants were given in the form of foodstuff or raw materials or agricultural supplies. So if you look at aid by sector, during 1945-52 was food and raw material accounted 87%. Almost 90% of aid was food and raw materials. With that, you cannot make a reconstruction or a growth. Okay. If I expand this data between 1945 and 61, again, food and raw material was 77%. So majority of three-fourths of aid was all food and raw materials during that time. And also those aid were accounted for 74% of total government revenue. But we cannot say all those food and raw material, which was 77% during 1945-61, we have to reclassify it because those food and raw material was actually sold in the Korean market. And then the proceed of that sale was deposited into central bank as a counterpart account. And the use of that counterpart account was in agreement between Korean government and the US government. Actual use of that counterpart account was interesting, but 35% was used for defense budget, 20% for other general current budget, and 45% were for reconstruction. And therefore, those 45% of reconstruction accounted for 70% of total public investment and the financial operation of the government during that period. Therefore, if we apply that one counterpart account into sectoral allocation, we can get this kind of reallocations. And the aid to Korea, infrastructure was 49%. Manufacturing and the agriculture production sector was 5%. So 54% was infrastructure and the production sectors. And another some 50% is social sectors and the general government recurrent sectors. And this one was very much in contrast with OECD DAC aid in current days. Look at in the social sector and the general government was more or less the same share, but infrastructure was much smaller than what the Korea did it. So about half of the Korea's share in infrastructure and the production sectors. That's why some 4 and 5% growth rate even during that time owes a lot to this kind of sectoral allocations. One thing, most of this infrastructure allocation was going to railways say like 37% of reconstruction aid, and the power and the manufacturing sectors. And some reconstruction aid was also given by UNCRA, but this UNCRA aid was only 4% of total aid, so we cannot say much reconstruction. That's why growth rate was much lower than compared to 60s and 70s, 80s. But one thing to be noted here is during this period, although there were heavy use of aid for infrastructure and production, a very small portion, 1.5% of our total aid was used for education. And then the small amount of aid for education was utilized in a very key areas. Priority was given adult literacy and the basic education. And therefore, illiteracy rate was 78% when Korea was liberated in 1945, but 1949, illiteracy rate was reduced to 22%. And then also, UNCRA and the UNESCO was helping Korea in the 6-year primary education program. So universal primary education was achieved in 1959. It's more than 95% of enrollment rate in the primary levels. During the Millennium Development period, I think all developing countries tried to achieve universal primary education even in year 2000. But Korea achieved primary education fully, universally in 1959. And that is due to this priority given to basic education in 1945 to 48 and the 50s. And the rest of the aid was given more secondary vocational education and higher education for professional training, more medicine, agriculture, engineering, public administration, and the business management like that. Also, in the this kind of aid can be made a good comparison with aid during 1960 and 99. During this period, especially in 1961, there was a military coup and the new government came in. And the new government pursued export-oriented industrialization through 5-year development plan. From 1962 until 1997, there was a 5-year development plan. And through this development plan, it aimed to achieve industrialization and faster economic growth. For that purpose, new government had some reform. The first one was a stronger foreign capital promotion law was made in 1962, and a more liberalized foreign capital inflow, and also started a negotiation with Japan for rapprochement and reparation in 1962, and that negotiation ended in 1965. So from 1965 until 1975, for 10 years, that money came in. And also in 1965, there was a tax reform to increase government revenue to finance these export-oriented industrializations. And another reform was realization of interest rate reform for domestic savings. Interest rate was increased from 15% to 30%. And also deposit rate was higher than for some years and then the lending rate like that. So very radical reform was made. Internationally, I already mentioned the OEEC was changed to OECD, so it has more relationship with developing countries, and Korea must benefit from that. And then also Development Assistance Group was established in 1962. And the UN designated 1960 as the first development decade, and 1970 as the second development decade. Right? And the World Bank created a soft loan window called IDA in 1960. So Korea started borrowing from IDA from 1964. And also U.S. Foreign Assistance Act was established in 1961 under Kennedy administration. And the U.S. made a strong commitment for economic growth. and also at the same time emphasized the borrower's responsibility. Therefore, it increased loans. Before, mostly it was grant, but after that, there's loan proportion was very much increased. In the academic field, growth theory was changing. Before, it was a Herod-Domar growth theory, which emphasized physical investment was key for economic growth. But it gave a way to neoclassical growth model and the human capital theory. So growth can be achieved not only for physical investment, but the human capital investment and also more population growth or employment increases and the productivity increases was realized. And Korea benefited from this kind of development. Okay. And therefore, objective of aid during this 1960 to 80 period was economic growth through investment and export of industrial goods and services. And aid, Korean government become very active and assertive and more proactive in identifying the need for aid and or allocating it to different sectors. First, if you look at the scale of aid, there was a sharp increase in total capital inflows. Because before, in the 1945-60s, $3.1 billion. But in this period, there's $81 billion. So very large increase in the foreign capital inflows. Out of that, the public capital inflow decreased. Before, totally it was a public sector capital inflow, but now only 26% was a public capital inflow. So the remainder 75% was more private sector capital inflows. And also another feature was a grant was before almost 100%, but it was reduced to only 5%. So majority of the public capital inflow was public loans. Public loans was before 1%, but now 95%. And most of this loan is OA type, is grant element smaller than 25%. So under more difficult, hard term, Korea utilized those aid and achieved a higher growth rate with that kind of loans. And the scale part, aid was about half of total investment in the 1960s, and then later about 10% of total investment. And also total investment ratio as a percentage of GDP was greater than 30%. During this time, other developing countries, the average investment rate was lower than 20%. And therefore, Korea's growth was driven by high investment, and investment was a lot financed by official aid also. Korea's fast growth during this period was 8.2% per year between 1962-82 was associated with foreign capital inflow. About 40% of that, or 3.3% of growth rate, can be attributed to foreign capital inflow, especially OA loans. That is studies made by some government. And another one, Import-Export Bank, they also made similar studies, and they came out more similar conclusions. Another one, Korea was very active in mobilizing aid and also coordinating aid, because currently under OECD Paris Declaration in 2005, where 180 governments all agreed, they say aid effectiveness should be improved. But for that purpose, aid should be coordinated. But who coordinate? Aid should be coordinated by the donors, it says. But during that time, Korea did not leave it to the donors. Korean government itself was mobilizing aid, and it was coordinating. The mechanism for coordinating is called the ECOC, is called International Economic Coordination Group for Korea. And it is donors recipient meetings. At that meeting, Korean government presented the investment and aid need to support the 5-year development plan by sector and the project. And then also it briefed about the progress of an ongoing aid project. So it started in 1966 until 1980. It was so successful. The World Bank adopted this one and used in many other developing countries. What it says called the consultative group meetings. Okay. As I said, during this period, the most of aid was shared by U.S. and Japan. Before, it was mostly U.S. 80% was U.S. But here, U.S. and Japan was more or less equally shared. And then, in addition, there was more multilateral aid. MDB World Bank played equally major role. For example, Japan provides 6.1 billion, U.S. 5.2 billion, and France 3.5 billion. And then World Bank provided $15 billion during that time. So we can see multilateral bank played a major role during this period. And also, if you look at again, during this period, the sectoral distribution of aid was more starkly different from OECD DAC aid pattern. During this time, they gave a very heavy infrastructure and production sectors, and a very small social and administrative loans. It goes 1980, it is more totally devoted to infrastructure and production sectors. But at the same time, again, just like in the 1950s, some small share of aid was reserved for social sector, administrative sector, especially for freestanding technical assistance for science and technology, and vocational education and the training, and for more innovations. And those were becoming a source of innovations and also satisfying the manpower requirement. Again, we can confirm Korea's use of aid was heavily skewed toward the infrastructure production sector and investment. And therefore, that kind of pattern becomes a major source of faster industrialization and economic growth. And that is in contrast with what donor countries are providing and the recipient countries receiving nowadays by DAC donors and recipient aid allocation. Then how I can show the evidence that the contribution of aid to growth. I said the sectoral allocation was the main source of fast economic growth. But recent studies show the aid that increases household consumption, just like in 1945-50s in Korea. It promotes growth also, but in the short run. But in the long run, it doesn't promote growth. It only supports consumptions. And in 2005, Radalet and the other people also studied aid for infrastructure and production sectors promote growth more greatly than aid for social and the government sectors. And in 2006, the Import and Export Bank economist, Mr. Lee, this is not me, another Lee also studied, showing that in the 1960s and 70s, the loan, most of the aid was loan, and loan promoted economic growth higher than aid during the 1945-50s, which was mostly grant, and then also mostly consumption. So when they invested more aid into infrastructure production sector, growth was higher, was shown. Let me show this Radalet sectoral distribution of aid. It says, his group argued, this is aid as percentage of GDP, and this is growth rate. On average, if you add all aid, growth rate increases very slowly like that. But this early impact aid, which is like transport or more communication, infrastructure aid, and production sector, the aid provided a higher growth rate. On the other hand, late growth aid, like more social sector and the government governance changes like that, was growing at a much lower rate compared to the infrastructure sector. Therefore, if you use aid for infrastructure and the production sector, it promotes a higher growth rate. How about then for poverty reduction? Because there was a sharp poverty reduction during Millennium Development era. In 1990, about 43% of the poverty rate was reduced to 21% in 2010. Now, if you have all investment, majority of aid invested in the infrastructure and production sector, could you reduce poverty? That kind of a question can be raised, right? But the answer is yes, because the recent studies, last year there were two studies independently. One was by World Bank, Ravalian, another one, and Chandy and the other group, and Brookings Institution. They all said how this poverty was reduced from 43% to 21%. The main source was growth, because growth contributed 2/3 of this poverty reduction this period. And the reduction in the inequity contributed only 1/3 of poverty reduction during that period. So, okay, it is important to reduce inequity also, but the more resources should be given to the promotion of growth. Then how you have a promotion of growth is you allocate more resources for infrastructure and the production sector. That will eventually contribute more to poverty reduction as well. That is my argument. Okay. And another point, how then you can implement the investment program or financed by aid well. And Korea did something very interesting one, which can be some lesson for other countries. In 1961, when Korea started the growth-oriented development policy, it appointed a very high-level planning and coordination officer in the Prime Minister's office. And his responsibility was monitoring and evaluation of important government policies and projects. But important government policies and projects were mostly 5-year economic development plans. Therefore, those 5-year economic development projects were mostly financed by aid, and therefore that person was monitoring and evaluating the aid-financed project. And in 1965, the government decided that a one-person group is insufficient. So they appointed some 15 professors to do independent monitoring and evaluation of this important project and programs. And that was very successful because outside independent evaluation, and the government was advised by this group. And it was so successful, by 1981, the number of professor group who are evaluating, monitoring increased to 107, and it was entrusted to Economic Planning Board. So I ran very rapidly. Let me summarize what I have expounded up to now. Is one, I can throw some 8 or 9 lessons I can summarize. First one is provision of consumption goods after liberation from Japan and after Korean War was very effective in staving off starvation or poverty, controlling inflation. However, it did not stimulate growth very much. But as part of emergency relief, Korean government utilized some small part of aid for education, but it was very well utilized to address the priority need in the basic education, secondary vocational education, and professional training, which became the foundation for industrialization to relieve the manpower constraint, laid the groundwork for industrialization during 1960s and 70s. And the third lesson is foreign capital inflow, especially official development assistance, made up the significant portion of fiscal deficit prior to development decade. And during development decade, it financed the investment gap. and then therefore it promotes the economic growth. Okay. Official assistance flow played a very important role during early stage. And the later stage, it invited more private capital inflow. Through this capital inflow, Korea could finance important investment programs and promote economic growth. Type and amount of foreign capital inflows or official foreign assistance may not be so important, because OECD is arguing very much, the TAC is arguing, it's grant is more promoting growth, not the loan, or a lot of academics join the studies in that one. But in my review, in the experience of Korea, which use grant and loan together, type and the amount of loan is not that important. More important one is a sectoral allocation pattern of aid. Because here, Korea used a grant, but in the grant did not promote much growth. But actually, loan was promoting more growth, but not because loan was more effective than grant, because that the loan was utilized during the economic growth period. The development policy was more geared to economic growth. And that's why at that time there was no availability of grant and only loan was available. That's why it used. More important is financial resources. The same financial resources, how they utilize in different sectors, that is a more important factor in promoting growth. As I said, I think infrastructure and production sector promote more growth. And if aid was utilized for that sector, it promotes more growth. And then also, government played a very important role in mobilizing, coordinating aid. And that's why it can invite the donors to invest more in the infrastructure and production sector. And when we got it in negotiation table, it persuaded more the donors to invest for that sectors. And another one was the mechanism for approving the aid and monitoring and evaluation was also peculiar in Korea. As I said, the monitoring evaluation, there was an independent outside professors group who were monitoring and evaluating and advising government. The other one is even introducing the loans. It was not approved by one minister, but it was a committee of the ministers. Therefore, it could reduce the possibility of political use or corruption. Okay, I think those were some summary of my the argument in this session. Well, thank you for your listening, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Very interesting presentation, especially the part about how the distribution has changed and how that has impacted growth. I guess before we open it up to questions from the audience, I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on why today we've moved more towards focusing on the social services sector rather than the economic infrastructure, which would seem to be sort of a natural place to start in terms of helping countries to develop?
That's a good philosophical questions. I think partly there may be several reasons, but I think that there are basically two reasons. One is people confuse between private charity and public official assistance. Private charity can aim for humanitarian purpose. But public official aid is for macroeconomic growth and distributing that benefit to the people more equally. And it is not for humanitarian purpose. It is for economic development purpose. But advanced country people, they confuse between charity and the public assistance. And therefore, they try to apply charity principle into public assistance. As a recipient, as a development assistant, development economist, I feel the official aid is economic development issues, is not the humanitarian issues. Humanitarian aid should be left to the private sector or NGOs, and the public officials should be accountable to the people for their use of budget and official aid by demonstrating they have achieved higher economic growth and higher level of living standard of the people. And that is, I think, fundamental reasons why OECD DAC or some strong the NGO group tries to argue for humanitarian purpose and important social sectors, and then they try to apply that principle into public official assistance. Second one is, I think, because of that partly, aid was not very effective, right? Since 1980, academics and politicians, practitioners were very hotly debating about the aid effectiveness. Because aid was not so effective, as I say here, very few countries achieved growth and the living standard was not improving. Therefore, people tries to use the public assistance directly for poverty reduction, directly for public services. I think it is partly influenced by that humanitarian reasons. But then maybe economically or economic development purpose is also effective. As I said, 1/3 of the poverty reduction was due to reduction in the inequity. But it doesn't have a sustainability. And therefore, to have a sustainability of poverty reduction, continuously reduce poverty, then you have to have larger pie. But how you get large pie is through investment and economic growth. And that's, I think, during the year 2000 Millennium Development Conference, a lot of head of nations were influenced by this humanitarian purpose. And so global development goals' main emphasis was more poverty reduction. And they don't talk about how to achieve their poverty reduction. It left to the individual government. And that's how come they didn't, individual government was influenced by donor NGO, and they didn't spend their money to achieve poverty reduction through economic growth. And they spend the money, aid directly to assist the poverty group. And that was not as effective as the Korean experience shows, which spend more for economic growth. And then the fruit of economic growth was shared by the people.
I'd like to open it up to questions now.
Please raise your hand and identify yourself. And we have mics around the table, so there's no need for a mic around the table. Yes.
Where's the mic?
Oh, no.
Speak.
Just, it'll pick it up. You don't have to hold it.
Okay. Thank you. Russell Pittman from the U.S. Department of Justice, Antitrust Division. Just following up on that, it sounds like from what you've described over the last decades that Korea was unusually fortunate among poor countries in getting a lot of this assistance that was focused on economic growth instead of humanitarian purposes. Have you looked at what's the reason for that? Was it because the Korean government was smart enough to say we want this stuff to build railroads and electricity, not humanitarian? Was it because there was something special about Korea that it was the institutions were good enough that you could invest in the railroad and electricity where you couldn't do that in Africa, for example? Why was Korea so lucky in this respect in terms of, or so smart in terms of getting this kind of assistance more than other countries did?
Well, I think that's a good question. I had some similar question to myself, But I thought there are two reasons. In the early 1940s and the 50s, as I said, Korea had triple disasters, right? It was a lot of destructions through Second World War or Japanese exploitation or Korean War. So a lot of infrastructure was destroyed. So it was more visible. And then policymakers felt, I guess, more to reconstruct the infrastructure. And that was the, I think, first reasons. But it is not only in Korea, because after the Marshall Plan was mostly financing infrastructure rebuilding. But the mechanism was also very similar. In the Marshall Plan was not directly financing infrastructure. It was lent to the private sector. And then when the private sector repaid it, that money was utilized for infrastructure constructions. And therefore, the situation was very similar because they have observed a lot of physical infrastructure destructions, and immediately they thought it is important to reconstruct that infrastructure. And the second one is during 1960s and 70s, as I said, Korea borrowed more from multilateral sources, say World Bank, IDA, and the World IBRD. And the IBRD was a large amount, okay? And the IBRD tends to give more infrastructure, although they give a fair amount for social sectors and the government sectors. And therefore, it borrowed more from multilateral sources. And therefore, I think it could persuade, and the Korean government could agree more easily in allocating aid fund for infrastructure and the production sectors. But many other developing countries currently, nowadays, are receiving more from bilateral sources. So bilateral donors are trying to give more social sector, as I say, the global development goals one. And therefore, a donor has a penchant to give more social sector directly to the poor, just like a private charity. And that's why I think that kind of a pattern has developed between early Korea and now current day developing countries, I think.
Yes.
I'd like to sort of stay on that same thing and go back a little further in Korean development to the time of the Japanese Empire, when the Japanese were developing northern China, Manchukuo, and that. There was a lot of emphasis in their empire building on infrastructure. The railroads in that part of Asia was a big factor in their kind of development plans. Now, the war was over, and there were Japanese who had trained Koreans in this development process. Do you see any linkages in that kind of training that Koreans had in the 1940s that would have also lent to this emphasis on infrastructure development?
I'm not so familiar I'm familiar with Japanese development policy in the Manchuria area. But I think rather than Japanese influence, I think the actual need for Koreans was more crucial for determining that kind of a sectoral pattern. Because one thing, Korea depended a lot the northern part energy system, because all energy in that time, Korea was mainly hydropower, and the hydropower was mainly in the northern Korea, between border area between Manchuria and North Korea. And 90% of all energy was coming from there. And then in the southern part, there was no much hydropower and then, or even thermal power. And therefore, it was very important immediately to build some power system because during the even Korean War, 1950-53, Korea's electric power supply was by 3 ships generating electricity in 3 ports in Korea. It was supplied by the electricity generated in the ship. By that much, there was a dire need for power generation, and therefore investment in power was immediately needed. And the second largest sector was the road sector, because of the development need and also private sector activities. I think road sector had to be developed. And Korea is a very rugged, is not very much plain areas. Therefore, they wanted to develop a road network. And that's why road and the power was key sectors in infrastructure. I think that kind of direct need at that time was more driving forces, I think, why Korean government was forced to invest more in the infrastructure, I think.
Yes.
Yes, visiting professor at Peking University and Georgetown University. Thank you for the good analysis and presentation. I really only have 3 questions for information purposes. The first one, if I understood your presentation, early on in Korea, a significant amount of the multilateral and bilateral money went to humanitarian relief. Isn't that a little bit contradictory with the end message? Number 2 question is, how is in the classification that you use investment, civil works for education classified on the social sector or on the infrastructure? And number 3, the red alert chart, the graph that you presented there, is he using, what is the sample of countries that he's using to project the trends?
Okay. First, thank you for the 3 questions. First one, yes, it is true in the early 1940s and 50s, most aid was humanitarian. Okay, 77% during that period was humanitarian aid or more. But the government did not utilize that one for distribution to the poor people, as I said. The goods or raw material received as a grant was sold in the market. And the government utilized the proceeds of the sale for development purpose. So that's the difference. Okay, and therefore, in early years, if one look at only direct aid, it is majority is humanitarian aid, but government utilized through counterpart fund, sold that raw materials or humanitarian goods, and then used the proceed for development purpose. That is very much why the Marshall Plan was more successful. Recently, Columbia University Business School Dean and other professors wrote Poverty Trap, some book a couple of years ago, and there it expounded that point. It was not directly invested in infrastructure. It was lent to the private sector. And then when private sector repaid it, government used their proceed for investment, infrastructure sector. It was a very similar mechanisms, I think. Second, so reconstruction of schools during that time, it was used as a social sectors because mostly it was UNESCO and UNCRA's assistance. But it was not large amount compared to the total aid. And also on that education part, a lot of parents also contributed for school reconstruction purpose and school supplies purpose. So I think school civil works for education did not account for large part of total aid. The sample countries, 60 countries I use is the all developing countries I could find in the official statistics of World Bank and the UNESCO the statistics. So I didn't select. I included. Radler graph. Oh, Radler graph was, I cannot remember exactly, but he used a large number of countries, about 120 developing countries. Also, probably he wanted to include as many as possible, utilizing World Bank, World Development Indicators like that, I think. So he didn't select for specific purpose sampling. Almost all developing countries which has some available data, he included that. Actually, original study is not by Radler, but Clemens, and then other people, working paper by Global Development Center, I issued one. But in the development finance magazine published by World Bank, IMF, the Radler rewrote that and the review of whole literature. That's why I cited his paper.
The gentleman back here.
Charles Belden, President. How did Korea manage to avoid what happens to a lot of economic development? No graft, no corruption or outright theft? You know, something like you find that you give some aid, it's left out in the open, and next thing you know, everything's stolen and ends up in the black market, that sort of thing. How did they avoid all that?
I couldn't find some black market statistics, but I think there is a fair amount of corruptions also, or favoritism. I don't know, I can reveal this one because it's a public, during that time, a lot of some public glitches. For example, famous now, the Samsung, for example, at that time was given a major license to import or trade, and then given a lot of favoritism by the political party. So at that time, most important raw material coming on is like a cement, sugar, and wheat, right? Wheat flour. So we call it three white powder incident. So government was giving a lot of favor to that one, and then it turned out company had a lot of profit, and then it gave kickback to the political party like that. So I think like in any government, there is a fair amount of corruption, but the government introduced some mechanisms to reduce that degree of corruption. As I said, introducing the aid was not by one minister, like in many other countries, but it's a committee of the ministers has to approve that kind of a loan. And then foreign loan was also approved by the Congress. Indebtedness of government was approved by the Congress also. And then also the aid finance project was monitored by external group, like a professors group by field. And therefore, I think there's more watchful eyes, and so probably degree of corruption must have been much lower than without such mechanisms, I guess. But do you see any other developing countries which have that kind of mechanism nowadays? I don't think you can find any other countries which have similar mechanisms. I haven't found my 30 years work with the World Bank. So I think that's very unique in the Korea.
The gentleman right here.
From the William and Mary. The Korea is now a member of the OECD DAC, and having no control over the allocation of the aid money there. This is multilateral. But in terms of the bilateral aid giving to other countries today, does Korea give more aid to support the infrastructure and production rather than the social service?
Good question.
Oh, yeah, questions. Yeah. Yes. Korea became DAC member in 2010. So it has, just like other member countries, in 2013, it has some special review by the DAC peer groups. And in that review, they pointed out Korea is giving too much loan instead of a grant. Okay, and the second one is it gives too much aid for infrastructure than social sectors. And then Korea defended, okay, this is based on our Korea's development experience. It is not because of the loan and the grant the aid become effective or not. It is how to utilize it. And Korean experience shows an infrastructure investment and production sector investment promote more growth. Therefore, it is justified. Now, there's more the fine point is that Korea was lending even so low-income countries, and then the low-income countries will be more highly indebted, and therefore, Korea is going to add some more debt to the low-income countries. Therefore, it should give more loan to high-income countries like that. That was a fine point. But I understand, I heard through government officials behind the story, there was a big debate in DAC meeting in Paris, and why Korea was giving so much loan for especially infrastructure like that, and they should reduce like that. And Korea was defending. It was a hot debate in a special session, I was told. So I think opinions are still very much divided. And then final decision was, okay, let's don't touch that kind of thing in the report. So in the report, it is not said. It's mute.
All right, we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Gentleman right back here.
Oh, thanks. My name is Norman Van Doyle from the U.S. International Trade Commission. I thank you very much for a very comprehensive discussion of the role of aid in Korea's development. And you mentioned that one of the reasons why the Korean economy grew very fast during those times are partly because of other things, but mainly because of the distribution of aid. I just want to ask you a question at the limit of this discussion, which is, what is the role of the indirect aid provided by the U.S. government through the war of Vietnam? Because there's quite a few, as far as I know, there are quite a few American in the American military expenditure in Vietnam, during that time, the U.S. have outsourced quite a few contracts to Korea, Japan, the Philippines, and I just would like to hear your comments on the link between that growth and the demand pool type of expenditure there.
Then we'll just grab your question as well. Oh, okay. All right.
I'm not a political scientist, so I don't want to delve into that detail. But as I understand, when U.S. government asked the Korean government to dispatch some soldiers to Vietnam, there was some agreement, because at that time, U.S. government was selling weapons to Korea. It is no longer giving military grant to Korean army forces, and therefore Korean government also some important weapons even U.S. Restricted. So I think they negotiated a certain kind of weapons Korean can buy it, and then also to purchase it, Korea needed more money, and therefore U.S. government will give more military loans. Loans for military weapon purchasing purpose like that. But those aid are not the economic development aid, so it is not included in the official statistics of ODA, official development aid. There's military aid or some other types of official aid. And therefore, the amount, how much Korean government get, or how it was influenced, the aid, I don't know it. But beside that, there are also some outsourcing contract. I think a lot of private sector benefited from that kind of outsourcing contract. But that is a regular trade. So it is a trade statistics, and therefore it is not part of aid either. So many other countries also get that kind of contract. Like Japan got more the benefit than Korea because of Vietnam War. And then also during Korean War, Japan got the more benefit. That's why they gave a lot of loan to Koreans, I guess. But those are classified as a trade, not aid, or some military aid is not classified as a development aid. So I think you don't have to consider that one as part of aid effectiveness. Yeah.
Well, Dr. Lee, thank you for a very interesting and insightful discussion, and especially on the importance of how you spend the aid. So join me in thanking Dr. Lee. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay.